I know you're probably all thinking about lunch, but I'll try and be as quick as I can. I think Sue wants the session to go on for about another 15 minutes, I think that's right, something like that, but hopefully we'll get there. My name, as I said, was Roger Hickman, and I'm Director of an organisation in Totnes called the Network of Wellbeing. I'm going to really speak about two things. I'm going to say a little bit about the Network of Wellbeing, but that's just for promotional purposes. But mainly what I'm going to talk about is what wellbeing is and why it matters, and how we measure it, and say a little bit about well-being in a learning environment. I ought to say at the outset, I'm a little bit sort of trepidatious. I'm always trepidatious when I speak to people whose profession is teaching, because you know far more about presentations and learning styles and conveying information than I ever will. And so hopefully I'll manage to do it all right. But I wanted to start you off with really asking two questions to think about maybe when I'm speaking, and I'm going to come back to them at the end. And the first question is, how am I feeling now? So think about that. And the second question is, when was I last really happy? And what was I doing? And I maybe open up by saying a little bit about the answer to that question. For me, I'm actually really quite happy now. One of the reasons I'm really happy, obviously, is being here with you. Actually, it's also that I got to go on a new train ride today. I have never been to Exmouth, and I have never been down that line. And I always I've had a rule over 25 years that whenever I travel on a new train line, I always stop working and look at the view to see what there is to see. And it was an absolute joy to come down that line today. So thank you very much, Sue, for inviting me. That being said, Network of Wellbeing. Okay, well, our vision is a world where everybody is as happy as they can be. A well-being needs of everyone is met in line with a sustainable planet. We were founded very much with an environmental ethos, but wanting to look at what makes people truly happy and contented, because I think for many of us we realise that the traditional environmentalism portrayed sort of people as the criminals, people as the enemy, and we wanted to put people back into a position of the centre of the world, but also we were concerned that we wanted to sort of say something about what life was really about and what life was really for. And this, for me, came out of my own experience. I used to work for 25 years at Friends of the Earth, and I was one of the things I was charged with doing at my latter end of Friends of the Earth was trying to distill the messages of the organisation together, and that led me to sort of rethink what I believed in terms of the environment and this sort of stuff, but also very much to sort of think, well, if we were saying, you know, people shouldn't travel too much, or shouldn't commit too much pollution, or shouldn't do too much of this, or shouldn't do too much of that, what are we saying they can do? And that very much got me into well-being, and got me into the idea that actually there are things we can do that are good for us, that are don't have an impact particularly on the planet, and there's plenty enough room in the world for everyone's well-being needs to be met in ways that don't damage the planet and the ability of future generations. And that's really the ethos for the organisation. So what do? Well, we're about building well-being together, and we do three things. We explore well-being, and the first, I'd recommend you have a look at our new website. You can see lots and lots of articles in our new website, and if you don't like reading, you can see lots and lots of videos and webinars as well, from different people around the country, in other parts of the world, people as far away as Bhutan, people as far away as South America, saying what well-being is all about for them. And people are trying to think, how can we make people's lives happier, using evidence we've got. Secondly, we're about bringing people together. We organise lots of events. This is an event we organised in a place called Hawkwood College, an adult learning centre you may have come across up in Stroud last year, where some of the UK's top experts came together. We did workshops for people and that sort of stuff. And we've also got ourselves a new little retreat centre, which was one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me in my whole life. Is last year somebody offered to give us a pair of barns in the Devon countryside, and so they did that, and that was wonderful. And we're using that for yoga, for various different sorts of, it's always been used for yoga, but we're using it for various different sorts of retreats, and bringing people together so they can come and learn about what makes people happy and what makes people well and so on. And thirdly, we're about putting wellbeing into practice. And we do that in Totnes with some projects. We have a monthly bring and share supper where anybody in the community can come along. All they have to do, and they don't have to do it if they don't really want to, is to bring a dish that they were willing to share with other people, and they can eat a 3-course meal with all the food that's brought together by people. We usually have about 30 to 40 people there. A lot of them of parents of small children, a lot of older people maybe who want to mix, maybe left on their own a bit, want to mix. But sometimes at Christmas time we've had as many as 300, which is quite an achievement, quite an amazing experience. We also run something called the Share Shed, which I'm extremely proud of. The Share Shed is a library of things. I don't know if you know library of things, but they're where you can go along and you can borrow, say, an electric drill, if you haven't got one and you want to put up a set of shelves. And the idea behind this is partly to reduce consumption, but also partly because actually if we share things, we build relationships with each other, and building relationships with each other is right at the heart of what wellbeing is all about. And also that people can achieve things that they may be otherwise not being able to achieve. An awful lot of people who live in Totnes live in flats. They haven't got a huge amount of room, and if anybody of you who lived in a flat will tell you, I'm sure when I lived in a flat in London, I knew this, that actually you haven't got a lot of space to store the angle grinder, or to store the mitre saw, or to store the hedge trimmer, or whatever it is. And so actually having a place where you can borrow them is really quite useful. And so we run that as a project, and that's quite fun. And we give out small grants to a whole range of different causes and things like that. I'll tell you about that. So, wellbeing, what's it all about? I think the starting point, I would say, from reading quite a lot about this, actually, no, I'll start with the pictures. If you Google wellbeing, if you Google wellbeing with Google Images, you have a very clear idea of what wellbeing is and what happiness is. Wellbeing and happiness is that feeling you get when you stand in the field with your arms apart. And there are an awful lot of people selling that message, and almost invariably they will put a picture like one of those up because of their retreat, because of what they're doing or whatever. And clearly there's something, and this is borne out in research, something about being out in nature that is very, very good for us and good for our mood. But if you look at the literature a bit more, what you find is that there are 3 big sources of inspiration and information on what makes people happy. And this is a question that goes back all the way to the Greeks. Firstly, there's something called ethics, ethical philosophy. Aristotle originally conceived it. He started writing about different states of what a good life should be and what a happy life should be. And then if you talk to the experts, they'll talk to, we use phrases like eudaimonia and things like that are Greek words that are virtually unpronounceable, and sometimes I'll actually put them in Greek in their slides. And they refer to different Aristotelian conceptions of what happiness and well-being is all about. Secondly, there's religion. There's a vast amount in Buddhism particularly about what a good life is about, but all of the religions say something about it and what makes people happy. But thirdly, and I think this is where it gets interesting, there's a new science on this. About 20 years ago, positive psychologists, or psychologists I should say, realised that they'd spent the best part of a century looking at why people were ill, mentally ill, and what was going wrong with people. But they never really stopped to consider the question of, well, what actually makes people happy? And they founded a discipline called positive psychology, which is looking at what makes people happy, what makes people contented, what makes people well. And since then, they've done a huge number of studies, some of whom have involved vast numbers of people, to try and work out what makes people happy and build up a data. When I say a huge number of studies, in about 2014, I think it was, there was something like 13,000 studies in that year alone done using one of the common metrics for what makes people happy. So there's a vast amount of research coming out. And it's not just about happiness, it's about what people call a meaningful life, is a purposeful life. It has aspects to do with physical health, social life, spiritual health, emotional life, and people talk about it in terms of flourishing and thriving. It's worth noting that it's an outcome, it's not an output. It's not something you do that is happiness or well-being. It's something that comes from the things that you do. So, what does all this research tell us, this objective, and actually, sorry, coming ahead of myself, the new science, what they've particularly done is people have done questions, and there are 4 very simple questions they ask, and studies based around these questions. They ask, how happy were you yesterday, on a count of 1 to 10? They ask, how worthwhile do you feel your life has been over the last 3 months, on a count of 1 to 10? To what extent are you satisfied with the direction of your life over the last 3 months, on a count of 1 to 10? And how anxious were you yesterday, from 1 to 10? And they use these 4 questions, and you might think, well, this is trivial, this is madness. You can't tell how happy people are from that, a one simple question, how happy they were yesterday, or how satisfied they are with their life. But what they've done is they've then, using statistics, by asking this question of hundreds of thousands of people, they've correlated that information with things like where they live. It may surprise you to know that people who live near the coast in this country are generally, on average, slightly happier than people that live inland. People who live in London, for some reason, are slightly unhappier than you would expect. Having lived in London, I could probably guess why. People who live in the southwest England, given all the different things that we know about them, how rich they are, and so on and so on and so on average are inexplicably slightly happier than people would expect. Probably something to do with the community and the small towns or something like that. People aren't sure. But there's a whole new science of work being done around what makes people happy, what makes people well, what makes people satisfied in the long run. And that's quite important. And a couple of things it's found. Firstly, well-being isn't random. Generally, wealthier people are happier than poorer people. It's not universal. There are plenty of unhappy and miserable millionaires. There really are, and that's a great tragedy, because you'd have thought they would sort their lives out, but they haven't. People who are unemployed, particularly men, are often miserable. There's a loss of purpose and a sense of well-being and worthwhileness and a life that is particularly bad for men. People who are overworked, people who work more than 35, 40 hours a week, are also less happy than the average. The average, and particularly the ideal, is if you maybe earn to work about 30 hours a week, and you do so voluntarily, of your own choice. In other words, you've got enough stuff, enough wealth, that you're happy to work 30 hours a week. Those people tend to be the happiest. People with mental illness suffer poor well-being. They suffer worse well-being than people with physical illness. And it's ironic. One of the ironies of modern life is that we spend an absolute fortune trying to solve physical health problems, and we don't spend hardly anything like as much as we should on trying to solve the problems of depression, anxiety, and other things that make people truly miserable over years. And that's something I think people like Richard Layard, who's been instrumental in this work, has argued very passionately about, which we change it. People in ethnic minorities suffer from lower well-being, and this is not just true of people in this country. One of the case examples is people from Greenland who were living in Denmark suffered lower poor well-being scores than people who were the indigenous population of people who grew up there and were born there. So that might be due to a sense of being perceived to be outside and other and discriminated, even if we thought they weren't discriminated against, leaving aside all that. The very feeling of being other may well sense a sense of loss of belonging and so on. And some cases, as I said, are good for well-being, some cases are bad for well-being. One of the key results, and one of the things that's really interesting for a lot of economists, is despite the fact that we're all getting richer, in theory, people aren't getting any happier. They're not more happier than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And if you look at countries around the world, what you'll find is that people in the poorest countries tend to be quite unhappy for obvious reasons. They're lacking basic material needs. But once you get to a certain point, generally speaking, people are happier. And then huge amounts of increase in wealth don't seem to make that much difference. The countries that are happiest, places like Denmark, places like Sweden, not necessarily richer than countries like Abu Dhabi, countries like America, where they're much, much, much less happy. So happiness doesn't necessarily correlate too closely with the wealth of the country. The second point I want to make, the big point about happiness, is happiness matters. On average, people who are happier are healthier and live longer, up to 7 years longer. So it's really quite important that we think of ways of making people happier, because happy people are more productive. It's no surprise that the big corporations want to know how happy their workforce is, because they're more productive, they're more willing to work in teams, they're more willing to accommodate change, more flexible in what they're doing if they're happier. Happy people are more sociable, more optimistic, they're more generous, they give more to charity. And I haven't put it on the slide, happy people learn better, apparently. It's one of the findings from this study, so very important in terms of the well-being. So a lot of people are interested in well-being. You'll find a lot of those books that people write about happiness are in the top sellers in terms of the non-fiction charts and so on. But is it quite important in terms of it actually makes a big impact on people's lives? Well-being. Okay. So what do we know that we can say to anybody straight out? Well, about 10 years ago, an organisation called the New Economics Foundation was doing a project for the Treasury, and they had some money at the end of the project, a couple of £100,000. You can see the Treasury has very big budgets, and they said, well, look, rather than just give this money back, why don't we do a project where we try and distill the wellbeing research into some simple metrics that people can learn and remember. And they were very struck by the whole idea of 5 a day for vegetables. Remember your 5 a day? I presume you all eat your 5 a day, yeah? And they came up with something called the mental health 5 a day. And over time, these have evolved into the 5 ways to well-being. And they're very simple. Be active physically, it's good. Connect with others. This is the holy grail of happiness. If the evidence suggests that the more people you're connecting with, the more friends you've got, the more socialising you're doing, the longer you're likely to live, the happier you're likely to be. Learn. There's a result for you, isn't there? Learning is good for your well-being. I can validate this. I remember when I was working at Friends of the Earth, I did a master's, and I used to come out of Friends of the Earth at 5:25, almost on the dot. Go up the underground to Birkbeck College and sit there for a 6 o'clock lecture. And 10 minutes later, all the stress had gone. Everything I was worried about what was going on at work or what wasn't going on, had been forgotten. And I was just agog with something to do with European politics, which is bizarre. But learning absolutely is one of the big ways to well-being. And what you do as encouraging learning is really important for people. Giving is really important. If you give your time, if you give your money, if you give of yourself to something, that's really important. And that's a way people feel that they're contributing, they're giving something back. And one of the things I talked earlier about the difference between a happy life and a fulfilled life. And one of the conceptions of this that I think is particularly pertinent is people talk about what they call, I can't remember the Greek words. There's a sort of conception of happy that you just do whatever's good at the time. You smoke, you drink, you party, hedonic. That's the word I'm looking for. You know better than I do. And what that tends to mean is there are some people who are a bit like that, but for most people that doesn't work. But a purposeful life, one where you do what you're good at, that can make a lot more people happy. But a really, really good life, so the even more purposeful life, and this is one where you do what you're good at in the service of others. and that apparently can keep you motivated and happy for decades. And that's really, really, really good for you. So that giving is important. And finally, the taking note of yourself, your breathing, taking note of your surroundings. How is the world changing around you? That's important in terms of well-being too. So 5 ways. Can you bring the 5 ways into your learning? And well, we bring up 5 ways. Actually, maybe I have. I don't know. One of the ways you could do that is to look at what the evidence says about adult learning itself, about barriers to learning, about children's learning, and so on, and well-being. And there's an organisation, the government set up £2.5 million to an organisation called the What Works Centre for Wellbeing to collate research on this from around the country, and they've produced evidence, and you can look at this and think, okay, I can maybe bring in a bit of this in my teaching. They've also looked at the question of what stops people from learning, and poor well-being is a major cause of people not learning. The bad news about this is that there actually aren't that many studies about how you address that, but it could be a big part of what might help an individual move from being a poor student to being a good student. If you could think of ways of making them a little bit happier. I think I've missed a slide, but I'm not sure. I know. Yeah, I just want to say a little bit more about this. The stuff on the right, an awful lot of what we're trying to do with wellbeing, or part of what we're trying to do, is to talk about some of the things that are really, really good for people's well-being. And there's a whole load of activities, and a fun run is a great case in point. A fun run involves physical activity. It involves giving of your time to a cause you believe in. It might involve sociability. You do it as a group. It might involve learning something, taking note. It hits quite a lot of these bases in one go. Likewise, going forming a walking group, becoming part of a walking group. You get your physical exercise, you get your sociability. Very often you learn something about the place you're in for the walking group. From the walk itself, you maybe visit a church or visit a ruin along the way, or see a bird or something. Somebody else you're with has got some bit of expertise that they can impart to you, and so on. A dance class, learning to go dancing. Physical exercise, sociability, a bit of learning going on, maybe taking note of yourself, whatever. All of these things that we associate with as voluntary community activities are all brilliant ways of getting your 5 a day. And so I guess one thing I wanted to leave you with is those sorts of things, and I think adult learning is part of it, are the foundations of what a good society is all about. And many of those things don't cost an absolute fortune to provide. Many of those things can be organised in people's spare time with a certain amount of support from the government, a certain amount of support from local authorities. And an awful lot of what matters for well-being, therefore, is not something that comes from conventional business or conventional economic thinking, but comes from the stuff that business and society, so business and conventional economic thinking don't really think about. It's the glue, it's the women's institutes, it's the U3As, it's all of those sorts of things that are actually incredibly important for people's well-being. The residents association, the community group, the hall down the road where people do their dance classes. Those things really matter if we're going to create well-being in our communities. But that's enough of what I was going to say. Sorry I forgot that till the end. I was going to leave you though with the stuff about what works for well-being, and really maybe come back to then think those questions about how you're feeling now and when were you last happy. At that point I'll take questions, and if anybody wants to ask a question, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions first though. You can probably guess which ones they are. question?
Well, my question, I do have a question, is it feels like that government policy is very out of sync with this at the moment. And that is a real worry. David Cameron came in with the big society idea, and actually government policy is working so opposite in so many aspects of the way our country is run at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just, it's really, I mean, since the crash 8 years ago, I mean, leaving aside the fact average incomes for the average person in this country haven't risen, and huge amounts of cutbacks in all the sorts of things that matter,
The glue,
yeah. And the funny thing is that's not translating particularly, I've seen into huge amounts of evidence for poor well-being, but I think it's beginning to appear in pockets.
Well, I've just come out of teaching, and I can certainly say in teaching there's a huge issue over the well-being of teachers. We're doing a lot on the well-being of our learners, our children, but there's not enough being done for teachers. And I've got people in the police force and the fire service and the NHS and the prison service, and there is a huge crisis in those areas.
No, that's right. I mean, we're hearing that quite a lot in terms of, at the moment, it's not necessarily in the communities, because those people who are caring for those communities are working extra time.
Yeah.
And that is true in the health service, and that is true in education. Yeah, no, definitely. And I was going to ask you a question, because how you are, and when were you last happy?
Right, well, I'm actually going to say I feel really super happy today, because this for me is a complete career change.
Good.
And I've had some years of not being happy in the education service, so I feel very happy today.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Any other questions? Lisa?
There was a point on what well-being is when you say if you're mentally ill, your well-being is not going to be good. But I think it should be unilaterally. If you've got a poor well-being, you can become mentally ill.
Yes,
so one doesn't precede the other necessarily.
No, true.
It wasn't quite clear on that particular PowerPoint that it could be unilateral.
Yeah, and it could work either way. I mean, people with low well-being are more vulnerable to mental illness.
Yeah,
definitely.
Can become mentally ill even if they weren't so far because of their low well-being.
And how are you anyway?
That sounded like, are you mentally ill? No, I'm okay right now, yes.
When were you last really happy?
Oh, when I dug out the potatoes.
Oh. Fantastic. Great. Okay.
So I'm just quite interested in the idea that the pursuit of happiness is something also that needs to be clarified in terms of, obviously we're seeing that the problems in social media of a certain kind of pursuit of happiness in terms of Facebook images of everybody having a wonderful time and teenagers feeling that they have to be beautiful, everybody else is beautiful and happy all the time, and addressing that actually life is not always necessarily a lot of fun, and how do we deal with that? It's not, we can't expect to be happy all the time. So I just think that's quite an interesting, I just wonder whether the wellbeing organisation kind of addresses, it looks to me like you're kind of looking at real reasons, of people being happy, but I'm wondering whether that's not another area that you address is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a great meme. I probably shouldn't answer a question about social media, but I come out with a meme that I saw on Facebook. Yeah. But it just made me laugh. It's what about this dialogue between the parent and the kid that said, the world is facing incredible threats. We're all getting poorer. I'm having to work harder and harder and harder. And you're saying it's the social media that's making me miserable. Yeah. But I suppose there's definitely, I'm sure there is an issue about trying to encourage, and my partner she's got 3 daughters, and I've grown up with those daughters, so to speak, and I know how much how many photographs they've got on Instagram and and this sort of stuff, and there's definitely an issue somehow that we've got to address to make sure that those girls and boys know that just because they haven't got 250 likes doesn't mean to say they're not worthwhile, and there is more to life than that. I agree with you. I guess I'm also slightly worried. I get a bit worried when people sort of say we should accept being unhappy. because there's no doubt that there are periods of our lives when we will be miserable and unhappy. There's no doubt about that. And you know, grief, for example, when people die, is absolutely appropriate. And then, you know, there's stuff in psychologists have criticised, for example, new definitions of depression that suggest that you could be diagnosed with depression, you know, in an afternoon. If you're just miserable for an afternoon, was one way of putting it, you know, because somebody died or something like that. And so clearly there are issues there. What I think is also important, though, is that we shouldn't ignore this evidence, and we shouldn't put up with being unnecessarily happy, or a change in society that leads people to being unnecessarily happy, when we know actually that it could be another way, and we could do other things that would actually make people happier. So how are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, yeah.
And when were you last really happy?
Well, actually, I had a really good weekend with family, extended family, and that always makes me happy. Connections, friends and family.
Absolutely, brilliant. Next question.
I just wonder whether we kind of lack words for what you're trying to describe. And happy is a bit of a, it's a bit intense,
Yeah,
isn't
no,
it?
it is very intense. Yeah.
In a way, to me, you almost seem to be describing contentment, or peace, or satisfaction, or something. But happy, we cannot expect to be happy all the time.
No.
It's just not
No.
a real thing. It's not.
No. Sorry. Go for it.
And there's a risk that you kind of set yourself up to fail, don't you, if there's an expectation.
And we put the pressure on our children. Oh, we just want them to be happy. Well, that's a difficult thing for them to do, really.
No, I think that's right. And again, you hear this written in some of the in the States. There's sort of people, an argument that if we focus too much on happiness, we run the risk of making people ashamed to be miserable. You know, and that's the last thing anybody wants to do. Yeah. Yeah. And there's also, I mean, I think you may have seen advice in some of the literature, or some of the sort of practitioners about happiness, that you should ditch people who are unhappy. You know, Joan, find the people that give you energy, ignore the ones that don't. And that's not what we're saying at all. You know, and I think you know, we really have to continue to be supportive people, and we have to recognise that, yeah, it's not just about happiness. We tend to use happiness as a shorthand for just talking about the whole of this well-being stuff. You know, and maybe
it's a bit off-putting in a way for some people. I've had this discussion with somebody else. And you know, it's too vague and strong a word in a way.
No, sure. And that's one of the reasons why we call the network of well-being.
Yeah.
You know, before I got there, my colleagues called it that. When were you?
Pardon?
How are you using that now? And when were you last?
I'm always happy.
You remember when you were last? You felt I'm so happy, and what you were doing?
Going to sleep.
Great. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else want to say when they were last really happy and what they were doing? Can I tell you why?
I'm happy every morning now, saying thank you, another chance.
Gratitude.
Yeah.
Gratitude makes people very happy. And there's an exercise that psychologists suggest people do, which is just you think of the things you're grateful for, and that apparently improves your mood.
Before you go to bed, write down 5 things that you are grateful for or have achieved in the day, rather than think of all the things you've still got left to do.
Gratitude journal.
Gratitude journal. Yeah. Well, it's good practice.
So I suppose it's a matter of personality, isn't it? You can't help somebody who's optimistic being always happy. I've got a friend who's always happy. It doesn't matter what she went through, and she's had a very poor life. She comes from a poor country, but she's always happy. So it's something also you're born with, isn't it?
It's the resilience, though, isn't it? Isn't that the word resilience? So you can do lots of things to build up your own resilience, and those things help your resilience, and then later on in life. And there are some people who are naturally more resilient than others.
I mean, resilience is about one's ability to deal with stress.
Yeah.
And again, interesting research that apparently people often talk about stress being bad for you, and apparently if you know that stress, and you're managing stress well, stress can actually be quite healthy. But you have to be able to know that you're in control of it and this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, sorry, was something.
I was just saying about resilience. You know, that sounds like this. Your friend is very resilient, and even though bad things have happened, she's learnt from them and developed her own inner resilience so that she can maintain her.
Well, I think it's always like that.
But I think there is some learnt behaviour there as well, isn't there?
What the psychologists say, is that about 60% of this is genetics,
Yes.
and there's 40% we can change, and that 40% could be quite significant, you know, and that's where it's really worth looking at and thinking about what we can do ourselves, and that's also maybe worth thinking about what we can inculcate in terms of teaching, you know, in terms of what people we teach can do for themselves as well. And if you've got any thoughts about that?
Okay, a question. If we could do one thing as a tutor to support the resilience, the happiness, well-being of our students, what would you suggest that it was?
Get them to connect with each other. Get them to talk to each other.
I was going to ask you, Robert, chiefly, were you able to talk to anybody on your journey today?
I could have done.
They thought you were mad, like, who are you?
I didn't.
No.
We did at one point, Toy, we were trying to organise a sort of national talk to your neighbour on the train day, to encourage people to sort of be more sociable on trains. But no, I could have done, but I didn't. And, yeah.
I don't know if it's a cultural thing, but connect sounds easy.
Yeah.
It could be a cultural. We were learning how to greet each other today, but if you talk to a complete stranger, they'll probably think, do I know them? You actually see them look rather puzzled, like, I don't know who you are. And before you ask, yes, I did talk to somebody today. It was the car parking attendant who you may have met down at the seafront, but in a good way. And he actually said, have a nice day. And I said, and you too. And he wasn't about to put hopefully a parking. Okay. But it's just how something like connecting should be easy. But it isn't.
Other people find this in their tutor groups, or some tutor groups, sorry, like the school teacher, in your classes. But sometimes there's a conversation that kind of is very, almost you'd think was quite trivial about what, they'll start picking up on a soap they saw last night or something while they're doing something. And it's amazing how important that is to the dynamics of the class. Do you know what I mean? They'll start talking about something that's probably irrelevant to what you're teaching, but I actually think that was really important just to get everybody connecting and talking.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? Because I had a wonderful experience with a group of people from all different lifestyles. They were coming together to start work at Tesco's actually when we did this sort of training course. So there was graduates, there was a lady that hadn't worked since she was about 18, and I think she was in her 50s. She was sat next to the graduate, and you could tell this whole group, you know, people that had been unemployed, the people that didn't want to be there, there was a whole group. And I think it was the graduate, the young lad, I think it was him that actually started a conversation about food. And then all of a sudden, and I don't know how it happened, we got onto ambrosia custard. How absolutely lovely it was. And that conversation went on for a good 10 to 15 minutes. Brilliant. And I didn't want to stop it because everybody got involved in it, you know, and it was just incredible. I've never ever experienced anything like that
Good
before.
neutral topic.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
well-being, it has a good feeling about it, ambrosia custard, doesn't it?
Yeah. And you know, and actually it was lovely for this because I could tell straight away that they were not comfortable sitting next to each other. They really were. And then, you know, it just took the second session, and we were off about food again before we
Mhm.
started. We were obviously just people that just love talking about food.
Carolyn, just before lunch as well.
I know, absolutely, absolutely. But who'd have thought, you know, when I actually reflected on it afterwards, I thought, my word, you know, there it was, the icebreaker, ambrosia custard.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Do you get, presumably you get your classes to do icebreakers and all that sort of stuff? Yeah.
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 But sometimes it happens organically, like you're saying, and you have to monitor. Actually, I'm not going to stop this conversation
No,
because
that's
it's
right.
so valuable to the
Absolutely.
dynamic in the class.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, it
Yeah.
wasn't meant to be, but it just happened.
Mm.
It's brilliant.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Anybody else or?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that feeling because we're so conscious of we've got a lesson plan or at the time that's set, we've got to get this much learning through. Can we even afford, you know, so we're always in that sort of fighting with ourselves whether we should allow it or not, because on the other hand we've got all these needs and we must achieve, etc., etc. But that, because it is so supportive of learning, to feel positive and feel good about yourself, it's actually well worth just letting those things happen within the lesson and just go with the flow.
Go with the flow. Anything else? Can I just maybe say one last thing about why I asked those two questions? Anybody like to has a guess or?
I suppose the second question is seeing whether it fits into those 5 things like being in nature or connecting with other people.
Yeah, it's trying to think. Well, there's 2 reasons. One is it's worth thinking about when we are happy and when we're not happy and what we're doing. And I'm not surprised about potatoes, and I'm not surprised about
Family gathering.
family gathering. You know, that's so classic. You know, and that is. And I remember hearing a talk. Somebody who's a youth worker got everybody to say what when they were really happy as a child, and he asked, and he said 3 questions about it, and he goes, "Were you outside?" Everyone goes, "Yeah." Were there any grown-ups around? No. And were there other children around? Yes. You know, and I think there is a connection between these things, and the sociability, the doing something you want to do is really important. And I think it's just worth thinking about that and making sure we have time, we spend time doing those sorts of things. And that's really what it's about. Thank you.
Thank you.